Okay, if you have your Bibles ready, let's open up to Matthew chapter 1. We're going to start there. That's Matthew chapter 1. And then we'll segue into what we'll be spending time with. Well, we are studying the women of the Old Testament, but I bring our minds to Matthew 1 because in verse 5 of this chapter, among the people that were in the genealogy of Jesus, we'll just read that verse. So Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. Now, one of the women that's named in this verse is this woman named Ruth, who had a son named Obed, whose father was a man named Boaz. Now, we spent some time in the book of Ruth last time talking about Naomi, but today we're going to focus our attention on this woman named Ruth from the Old Testament book that bears her name. So now we're going to jump back to Ruth, the book of Ruth, and that's where we'll spend the rest of our time today. So again, we're going to the Old Testament book of Ruth. Now, as you're turning there, if you're back in chapter 1, we know that from verse 1 of this book, of the opening chapter, the book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, at a time when there was a great famine in the land of Israel. It's during this time that verses 2 through 5 tell us that a man named Elimelech travels with his family to the land of Moab. And after they're there, Elimelech and the two sons of he and his wife, Naomi, die. And that leaves Naomi with her two daughters-in-law named Orpah and the other Ruth. When we go on into verses 6 through 13, Naomi insists that her two daughters-in-law return to their homeland, since Naomi at that point believes there's nothing more she can do for them, and they initially resist going back to their homeland. But it's those things, those facts I just mentioned, that set the stage for what we're going to be studying today. We're going to take a closer look at this woman who refused to return to her homeland of Moab, the woman named Ruth. The other sister-in-law eventually changes her mind. She goes back, but Ruth does not change her mind. She insists on staying with her mother-in-law by her side. So we're going to look at Ruth just briefly. We're going to look at who she was. And we're going to look at 4 different passages from the book of Ruth that reveal in short that Ruth was a woman of character, is how I'm defining her. And we're going to see that in the fact that she was a loyal woman from the first passage. We're also going to look at the fact that she was a Moabitess, is what the text calls her. We're going to see in some of the phraseology that she was a woman of excellence. And finally, from the 4th passage, we'll see that she was the great-grandmother of David. Now, from these things, what we'll learn, the application of this to us, is that we too have to work to a degree to be a person or a people of character. So we're going to begin in Ruth chapter 1. Verses 14 through 17, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses for us. That's Ruth 1, 14 through 17. Thank you, Matt. So we're going to look at the point that Ruth was a loyal woman. Now, what's the first thing that happens here in verse 14? Okay, they're crying. And what does Orpah do? What's implied in that? She's leaving, so it's basically a kiss goodbye. But then we have Ruth. What does Ruth do? Now, what does that mean that she clung to her? Okay, she held her. That's true, because the word clung does come from a word that has to do with sticking to or hanging on to something, but in this case, she's hanging on to Naomi. Now, how does that contrast with Orpah? Okay. Okay. So Orpah's following her mother-in-law's orders, basically. What's Ruth doing? Deciding not to. So that's what this clinging to her is. She's absolutely refusing. She hangs on to her. So at this point, the whole family has died, except for the two mother-in-laws, or daughters-in-law. Sorry, I'm jumbling my words. And so Ruth says, no, I'm staying. So she clings to Naomi. She doesn't want to leave her side. Now, how does Naomi respond in verse 15? She points out what Orpah's done. She says, your other sister-in-law has gone back. But we notice that Orpah is referred to as the sister-in-law of Ruth. Now, what this tells us is that Ruth and Orpah, they weren't sisters themselves. They were from different families. But Naomi's telling her, go back with your sister-in-law. Go back to Moab. And from the context we know is that's coming from a place that Naomi thinks there's nothing she can do for them. But Ruth still refuses, and we see that in verse 16. What does Ruth say to her? Okay. Well, how does that come forth in verse 16? What does the text say? All right. Don't ask me to go. What else does she say? Right. This is a pledge. Absolutely. That's good. That's a big, very significant statement. Why is that important? Absolutely. Exactly. So this is a very important statement that she makes. She's making God her God. And yes, that's because of the culture in Moab. There was all these other gods. But she's going to stay by Naomi no matter what it takes, including changing her religion, for the lack of a better term. Exactly. She's making a promise. She's going to take on everything Naomi knows onto herself. So she doesn't stop there, though. She goes into verse 17 and says, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. So she's continuing with her persistence here on staying. But what's the pledge she makes there in verse 17? Yeah, we could compare it to that. That's a very strong commitment she's making. She's not only making it to Naomi, she's also making it to God because of that last statement. Saying, if anything but death separates us, let God do something to me. And worse, she says. So this is commitment language. But the picture being painted here about Ruth is that she was a loyal woman. We see that in the language she uses. This is loyalty. She was not going to allow anything to separate her from Naomi except for death itself. Now, if this was not the case, Ruth's statement from verse 17 shows that she would be willing to incur a punishment from God and something worse if something other than death separated her from Naomi. So with all that in mind, one reason Ruth's words demonstrate loyalty toward God especially is because these verses illustrate a refusal to return to the gods of Moab and live by Naomi's side in service to the one true God. Now we kind of zipped through that. Any questions or comments on these verses? All right. Well, now we're going to jump to chapter 2. Look at a little bit of background from Ruth 2, verse 2, if somebody wouldn't mind reading that verse. Okay. Now, does yours read Ruth the Moabite? Okay. The New American Standard has it in the feminine form, the Ruth the Moabitess. But point being there that it's in the feminine form in the original language. But we're not going to spend a lot of time with the instructions that are given here. We're just looking at the fact that she was a Moabite, or Moabitess as the New American Standard reads. Now in this verse, the author is identifying Ruth in this way for the second of 4 times in this book. But the question I want to ask, why identify her in this way? Why not just say Ruth? Why does he say Ruth the Moabite or the Moabitess? Yeah, that's part of the picture here. So, but again, I said that this was the second of 4 times that she's identified in this way. The first time was in verse 22 of chapter 1. The other 2 times, in addition to this one, she's identified in verse 21 of this chapter in this way, and then in verse 5 of chapter 4. That's just something we should know. But what all these instances have in common, the 4 different instances, is that in each statement where she's identified in this way, it's connected with her work in the fields. Does anyone remember who these fields were owned by? Boaz. Yeah, that's who she's working for in a way. So what this tells us, since all these instances are connected with her work in the fields, is because at different points in the book, the author is emphasizing, as was said, that she's not an Israelite. Her background is from that idolatrous land of Moab. But as we know from the story, what eventually happens is that she marries the wealthy owner of these fields, Boaz. Now, we might not think this is important, but it is. One reason it's important to know this is because under normal circumstances, Jews were not allowed to marry non-Jews. That was law. But again, we have to remember this is set during the time of the judges. Now, can anyone remind me what was going on in the time of the judges? We spent some time with it not too long ago. But what were God's people doing during the time of the judges? Exactly, it's the cycle. Faithful to God for a while, they fall away, something happens, they cry out to God, judge comes, rinse and repeat, so to speak. So that's part of some of that background is here in Ruth. Boaz, a Jew, marries a non-Jew. But God's will is still done in the end. Why? Because it's through these people, Ruth and Boaz, among others, that Jesus comes. So God's will is still done. This is all part of the reason that the author emphasizes the fact that Ruth was a Moabitess. But but again, in connection with her work in the fields owned by Boaz. So again, another reason this is a significant fact is because it's a reminder that God uses people who are not his people to carry out his will. And ultimately, it's through this woman that Jesus would come, among others. Questions or comments on this verse? All right. So let's go to chapter 3, verse 11. That's Ruth 3, verse 11. Somebody wouldn't mind reading that verse. Okay, you have virtuous woman there, Sandy? Okay. That's okay. So, as we come to this verse, the author is recording a statement from Boaz to Ruth. What does he tell her? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. In the New American Standard, it reads, "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." Where you have virtuous, New American Standard has woman of excellence. You have worthy? Okay. Good, we have different. Matt, does yours read different? Or do you have woman of excellence there? Okay. Well, that's good. I like it when we have different readings because it gives us a little bit bigger picture. Well, what does Boaz say to Ruth here? Don't fear. She's proved herself. So yeah, don't be afraid. What else does he say? What's the offer he makes? There's a little bit of that. That's a safe assumption. But what's the offer he makes? Okay. He says, "Now, my daughter, do not fear." What does the text say after the "do not fear" part? You will do all that she asks. Whatever you want done for you, Ruth, I'll do it for you. Now, to give this a little bit of context, what brings us to this point is the fact that in an effort to make sure things would be well for Ruth, Naomi instructs Ruth to wash and anoint herself, put on her best clothes, and then go lay down at the feet of Boaz after he's fallen asleep. We remember Ruth's a loyal woman. She does everything Naomi tells her to do. So she does it. She does as she's instructed. Boaz wakes up, finds her at his feet, and obviously this startles him. He asks, "Who are you?" And then verse 9, she responds by saying that she is Ruth and requests of him to spread his covering over her because he's a close relative. Verse 10, Boaz offers a word of blessing to Ruth because of what she has done, because this is a demonstration of kindness. And then verse 11, "I will do whatever you ask. Do not be afraid." Why does he make this offer? According to verse 11. What kind of woman is she? The virtuous woman. And what did you have, worthy, Elaine? Okay. The New American Standard has woman of excellence. What kind of a woman is she based on that characteristic? Pretty good. Okay, why pretty good? Okay, she was on. Right. So there's all these things that are true about her. And the text says, "For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." So she had a reputation by this point. Now this word excellence or virtuous, whatever word you have there, it comes from a word that carries with it the idea of something or someone being useful or capable. But here, it is the idea that Ruth had proven herself as being capable of what she's done. And what that did was earn her the respect of Boaz and the other people who knew her. And again, this is a Moabitess, or Moabite, if you have it in that way. Someone who is not a Jew earned the respect of the Jews. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a very godly trait. Yeah, absolutely. She was a very kind woman. And all these things and more made her this virtuous woman or worthy woman of excellence, whatever you have there. Including Boaz, the owner of these fields that she was working in. So Boaz makes this offer. I know who you are. I'll do anything for you. Don't be afraid. Any other questions or comments on this verse? All right. Let's go to our last passage in Ruth chapter 4, verse 17. This will be our last one as we consider the character of Ruth. Somebody wouldn't mind reading this verse. It's one we read last time. Okay. Now, as we notice, Ruth's name is not in this verse, but she's still connected. What we're seeing here is the author of Ruth is bringing the book to a close. And this is the end of a section concerning the birth of a son that this verse says was born to Naomi, but was in fact born to Ruth. So one of the first things we should understand is that what brings us to this point, Ruth has married Boaz. Ruth conceives and gives birth to a son after the fact. Now from the more immediate context, from verse 16, what do we learn? What does Naomi do? Okay. Yeah. Right. There is some symbolism here. Now, what happened with Naomi's children? They died back in chapter 1. So, in a way, this is Naomi's son as well, by virtue of the fact that this is her grandson, and she also becomes his nurse. She was one of the primary caretakers of Ruth's child. So it's referred to as Naomi's son because she assisted in caring for the child. But what the author also records here is the name of this son, which was Obed. He eventually becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, what's Obed's relationship to David? Let's start with that question. Grandfather. So what does that make Ruth? Great-grandmother. What we're seeing here is a genealogy. It's a short genealogy of David that extends to verse 22 of this chapter. But Ruth is recorded as being someone who is in the family line of David. Now, from the broader context of the Bible, why is David important? Okay, he was king of the Jews, but what did we see in Matthew 1? Jesus. Ruth, Obed, Jesse, David. Way down the line, Jesus. So this is significant. Ruth is not named in verses 16 and 17, but she's still there. She was the great-grandmother of David. So the story of Ruth, it's not just about Ruth. These closing verses of the book of Ruth show it's also about David. And the story of David is ultimately about Jesus. So it's through Ruth, through David, that Jesus would be born. Matthew 1. Questions or comments on this verse before we wrap things up? Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that's there. That's true. Yeah, yeah, that's true. Jews and Gentiles. He says them both. Now, I'm glad we're thinking about this, and here's why. It's Ruth, the Moabitess. There is some non-Jewish blood in the bloodline of Jesus. People don't like to think about that. And I wasn't going to directly address it, but it's come up. There is some non-Jewish blood in the bloodline of Jesus. One of those being Ruth, and we're going to soon be looking at Rahab. Those are just two examples. Well, anyway, I won't be at the stoning in the parking lot, so you guys can feel free to stone me later. Just kidding. I know, but this is Ruth. So we've looked at all these passages. Again, I think the point, putting these all together, is that she was a woman of character. She had great character. She was loyal to Naomi. She was a Moabitess who chose to serve God. She was a woman of excellence, or virtuous woman, or worthy, whatever you had in that verse. And she was the great-grandmother of David. And that's significant because she was in that bloodline of Jesus. So the application is that we must work to be a people of character. Now from Ruth's story, something else we should understand is that because of who she was, Ruth struck that balance between finding favor with God and with man. The way she did this was by being the woman that she was in her service to God and to others. So if we're going to be a people of character, one thing we have to be engaged in is in service, both to God and to others. If we do that, we will become a people of great character and earn the respect of man and be pleasing to God. But again, that takes balance. We balance our service to God and our service to man, where we're first being pleasing to God above being pleasing to man. And we will build that godly character that we see in this woman named Ruth. But most importantly, godly character is built when we follow in the example of Jesus and follow his example above all else. Anything else on what we studied today? No. All right, Dean, would you close us today?